Tell me one truth rich people hate. The question drifted across the table like a quiet challenge, and for a moment, even the soft piano in the background seemed to hesitate. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers resting lightly on the rim of a crystal glass filled with sparkling water. The restaurant glowed in warm amber light, the kind that made polished wood shine and expensive watches glimmer subtly under dim chandeliers. Outside, Manhattan moved in restless waves, but inside, everything felt controlled, measured, curated. The kind of place where conversations were whispered and deals worth millions were made over perfectly plated meals. Ethan Caldwell was used to rooms like this. At 38, he had built one of the fastest-growing tech logistics companies in the country, a name that appeared regularly on financial news and investor briefings. People leaned in when he spoke. People laughed when he made half-hearted jokes. People listened. Always. Tonight was no different. 3 investors sat across from him, each dressed in tailored suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. They nodded as Ethan spoke, smiling at the right moments, agreeing before he finished his thoughts. It had become predictable, safe, boring. Ethan lifted his glass, then set it down again, the faint clink echoing softly. Tell me one truth rich people hate. He repeated, his voice calm but deliberate. The investors exchanged quick glances. One of them chuckled lightly, unsure whether it was a joke. Another shifted in his seat. No one answered. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just cautious. Ethan watched them carefully. He had learned to read hesitation the way traders read charts. People around wealth often measured their words, trimming honesty into something more acceptable. The third investor cleared his throat, then offered a polite smile. I suppose success comes with pressure. Ethan tilted his head slightly. It was a safe answer. Too safe. He nodded once, but said nothing, and the man leaned back, relieved. A moment later, a quiet presence approached the table. A young waitress placed a fresh cup of coffee near Ethan's hand with smooth, practiced motion. Her name tag read Emily Carter. She looked to be in her late 20s, her brown hair tied neatly at the back, her posture calm and steady. She didn't rush. She didn't hover. She simply set the cup down and adjusted the napkin with small, precise movements. Ethan noticed something unusual. She had heard the question. He could tell by the way she paused for just a fraction of a second before stepping back. Most servers learn to move quietly, to become invisible in rooms like this. But Emily didn't seem invisible. She seemed composed. Ethan glanced up at her. How about you? He said, his tone neutral but curious. The investors smiled, amused. One of them leaned back slightly, expecting a polite laugh or an apologetic shake of the head. Emily met Ethan's eyes. Calmly. No nervous smile. No hesitation. The piano continued softly in the background, a slow jazz melody that filled the quiet space between them. Emily didn't speak immediately. She stood still, her hands lightly folded at her waist, as if weighing something carefully. Ethan noticed the stillness. It wasn't fear. It was thought. Then she spoke, her voice gentle but clear. That wealth attracts attention, not admiration. The words settled quietly over the table. No one laughed. One investor lowered his glass slowly. Another glanced at Ethan, unsure how he would respond. Ethan felt the sentence linger in the air, simple and precise. Emily continued, just as calmly. And the richer someone becomes, the harder it is to know who actually cares. The restaurant seemed quieter than before. The piano played on, but the conversation around them faded into the background. Ethan studied her expression. She wasn't challenging him. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She had simply answered. For the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell didn't reach for his glass, didn't check his watch, didn't fill the silence. He just sat there, looking at the waitress who had spoken with quiet certainty, and something about her calm presence made the room feel different, as if the balance had shifted in a way no one else fully understood yet. Emily Carter gave a small nod, as if she had simply confirmed an order, then stepped back from the table with the same quiet composure. She did not wait for approval or reaction. She turned gently and moved toward the next table, her footsteps soft against the polished hardwood floor. Ethan Caldwell watched her walk away, noticing the unhurried rhythm of her movements, the calm efficiency that seemed untouched by the tension she had just created. One of the investors let out a quiet breath, almost a nervous laugh. Well, that was unexpectedly philosophical, he said, attempting to restore the easy atmosphere that had existed moments earlier. Another lifted his glass, forcing a smile. You asked for honesty, Ethan. Ethan did not respond immediately. He leaned slightly forward, his eyes following Emily as she refilled water at a nearby table. She spoke softly to an older couple, her expression warm but reserved, then listened carefully as they asked a question about the menu. There was something deliberate in the way she listened, something genuine that did not appear practiced. Ethan had spent years surrounded by polished communication, by people trained to say the right thing at the right moment. This felt different. He turned back toward his investors, but their conversation now sounded distant, less engaging than before. One of them began discussing a potential expansion in Chicago, mentioning square footage, shipping timelines, and projected returns. Ethan nodded politely, but his mind drifted. He found himself replaying Emily's words, not because they were dramatic, but because they were simple, clear, uncomfortable in their quiet accuracy. A few minutes later, Emily returned with a small tray carrying fresh, sparkling water and a neatly folded receipt for another table. She moved with the same calm focus, her presence unobtrusive but steady. As she passed by, Ethan spoke again. Emily. She paused and turned toward him, attentive but composed. Yes, sir. The title sounded professional, not submissive. Ethan gestured lightly toward the empty space beside the table. Where did you learn to answer like that? The investors exchanged amused glances, curious now. Emily considered the question briefly. I listen, she said simply. One of the investors chuckled. That is a rare skill these days. Emily gave a polite smile, but did not add to the comment. Ethan studied her expression. You seem very certain. Emily shifted her weight slightly, her hands resting gently against the tray. Certainty is quiet, she replied softly. It does not need to be loud. The investor across from Ethan leaned back, eyebrows raised. You know, you should consider writing a book. Emily shook her head lightly. I am more comfortable listening than speaking. Ethan noticed the way she said it, not as modesty, but as fact. He nodded once. Still, that was an unusual answer. Emily met his gaze again. People often speak differently when they feel heard. The words landed gently, but Ethan felt their weight. For a brief moment, he realized that no one at the table had truly listened to each other all evening. They had exchanged ideas, agreed politely, filled silence with conversation, but listening had been absent. Emily inclined her head slightly. Is there anything else I can bring you? Ethan glanced at his untouched coffee, then back at her. No, thank you. She nodded again and moved away, disappearing into the quiet rhythm of the restaurant. One of the investors leaned forward with a grin. You just got analyzed by your waitress. Another smiled. She is good. Ethan exhaled slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than amused. He glanced around the dining room, noticing how conversations continued as usual, how glasses clinked softly, how the city lights reflected faintly through tall windows. Everything looked the same, yet something felt different. For the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell realized that the most honest voice in the room had not come from the people seated at his table, but from someone who had nothing to gain from impressing him, and that quiet realization stayed with him longer than he expected. The conversation at the table slowly resumed, but Ethan Caldwell noticed that the rhythm had changed. The investors continued discussing projections and quarterly targets, yet their voices sounded softer now, as if something unspoken still lingered in the air. Ethan listened, nodding occasionally, but his attention drifted again toward the far side of the restaurant where Emily Carter was carefully arranging silverware for an upcoming reservation. She moved with quiet precision, aligning each fork and knife as though small details mattered. Ethan had built an entire company on attention to detail, yet he found himself wondering what had shaped her calm certainty. One of the investors leaned forward, tapping lightly on his tablet. If we expand to the West Coast, we are looking at approximately 70,000 square feet for the first distribution center. Ethan glanced at the screen, but the numbers felt distant. He gave a polite nod. That sounds reasonable. The investor smiled, encouraged, and continued outlining logistics timelines. Meanwhile, Emily greeted a new group entering the restaurant, her voice soft but confident. She guided them to their table, pulling out a chair for an elderly man with gentle care. Ethan noticed the small gesture. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet it carried a sincerity that felt uncommon. He watched as she listened attentively to the woman beside the man, nodding as she described dietary preferences. Emily did not rush. She did not interrupt. She simply listened. Ethan leaned back slightly, folding his hands. He realized that most people in his world spoke quickly, filling silence before it could become uncomfortable. Emily seemed comfortable with silence. It gave her space to think, to observe, to understand. A few minutes later, the investors began wrapping up their discussion. One of them checked his watch. "I have an early flight tomorrow morning," he said, gathering his papers. Another nodded. "Same here. This has been productive." Ethan offered a polite smile. "We will finalize details next week." They stood, shaking hands, their movements efficient and practiced. As they prepared to leave, Emily approached with the check, placing it gently on the table. "Whenever you are ready," she said calmly. Ethan glanced at the receipt, then looked up at her. "Busy night?" he asked, his tone conversational rather than formal. Emily gave a small nod. "It is steady. Do you like working here?" She considered the question briefly. "I like observing people," she replied. One of the investors smiled. "You must have some interesting stories." Emily's expression softened slightly. "Everyone has a story," she said. The investors exchanged amused glances, clearly entertained by her thoughtful answers. Ethan, however, studied her more closely. "And what do you observe most often?" he asked quietly. Emily met his gaze again, her expression calm. "People speak more honestly when they think no one is listening." The sentence lingered gently, like the soft piano notes in the background. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the thought. One of the investors chuckled lightly. "That is probably true." They thanked Emily and began heading toward the exit, their polished shoes gliding across the floor. Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, his fingers resting on the receipt. Emily stepped back, giving him space. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a sleek black card, placing it neatly on the tray. As Emily processed the payment, Ethan glanced around the restaurant once more. Conversations continued, glasses clinked softly, and city lights shimmered beyond the tall windows. Yet he felt more aware of the quiet details than before. Emily returned with the receipt, placing it gently beside him. "Thank you, sir." Ethan looked down briefly, then back up. "Emily." She paused. "Yes." He hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. "You seem to notice things others miss." Emily gave a small, thoughtful smile. Sometimes the quietest moments say the most. Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, then nodded. She stepped away, disappearing once again into the rhythm of the restaurant, leaving Ethan Caldwell seated in thoughtful silence, aware that something about this evening had shifted in a way he could not quite explain, yet he knew he would remember the calm voice of the waitress long after the numbers and negotiations of the night had faded. Ethan Caldwell remained seated for a moment after Emily Carter stepped away, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table as the soft jazz melody continued to drift through the restaurant. Around him, conversations resumed in gentle waves, and the glow from the chandeliers reflected off polished glass and silverware. He glanced down at the receipt, noticing the final total, then picked up the pen slowly. For years, leaving a generous tip had been automatic, almost mechanical, a gesture that came without thought. Tonight felt different. He paused, considering the quiet presence that had unsettled his usual certainty, then wrote a number deliberately before setting the pen down. Emily returned a few minutes later, her expression calm, as always. She glanced at the receipt briefly, and for the first time, a subtle flicker of surprise crossed her face. The tip was far larger than expected, yet she did not react dramatically. She simply looked back at Ethan, her eyes thoughtful rather than impressed. "Thank you," she said softly. Ethan shook his head slightly. "That is not for service." Emily tilted her head just a fraction, curious. "Then what is it for?" Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. "For honesty." Emily considered his answer, then gave a small nod, as if she understood without needing further explanation. "Honesty does not usually come with a price," she replied gently. Ethan gave a faint smile. "No, but it deserves appreciation." Emily accepted the receipt, her posture still composed, then placed it neatly into the folder. "I hope it gave you something useful," she said quietly. Ethan leaned back slightly. It did. There was a brief silence between them, comfortable rather than awkward. Emily glanced toward another table where a guest raised a hand politely, and she turned to go, but Ethan spoke again. Emily. She paused once more. Yes. Do you always answer strangers that way? She thought for a moment. Only when they ask real questions. Ethan studied her expression. And you thought mine was real. Emily gave a small, thoughtful smile. You asked it like you expected an answer. The words landed gently, but they lingered. Ethan nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in her observation. She stepped away, moving toward the waiting guest, her calm presence blending once again into the quiet rhythm of the restaurant. Ethan stood, adjusting his jacket, and took one last glance around the dining room. The investors had already left, and the evening crowd continued to enjoy their meals, unaware that anything unusual had happened. Yet Ethan felt a subtle shift in his perspective, as though the night had offered something unexpected. He walked toward the exit, the soft carpet muting his footsteps. As he passed near the service station, he noticed Emily helping a younger server organize a tray, offering quiet guidance without drawing attention to herself. The younger server nodded gratefully, and Emily returned to her work without seeking acknowledgement. Ethan paused briefly, observing the interaction. It was another small detail, another quiet moment that seemed to confirm what he had sensed earlier. She was not performing intelligence. She was simply living it. He continued toward the glass doors, where the city lights shimmered beyond the entrance. The doorman greeted him with a polite nod, and the cool evening air greeted him as he stepped outside. The streets of Manhattan glowed with headlights and reflections, the distant hum of traffic blending into the night. Ethan adjusted his watch, then glanced back through the window. Inside, Emily moved between tables with the same calm rhythm, her presence steady and unhurried. For a brief moment, Ethan Caldwell realized that he had attended hundreds of dinners, signed countless deals, and met thousands of people. Yet this quiet conversation with a waitress had stayed with him more than most boardroom negotiations. He turned toward his waiting car, but the thought lingered, simple and persistent, that sometimes the most valuable insight did not come from those who competed for his attention, but from someone who had nothing to gain except the courage to speak quietly and honestly. The cool Manhattan air carried a quiet stillness as Ethan Caldwell settled into the back seat of his black sedan, the city lights sliding across the tinted window like soft reflections. The driver closed the door gently, and the muted hum of the engine replaced the distant sounds of the street. Ethan leaned back, loosening his tie slightly, but his thoughts remained inside the restaurant he had just left. He had attended hundreds of dinners in places like that, each one blending into the next, filled with polished conversations and predictable agreements. Yet tonight lingered differently. The driver glanced briefly through the rearview mirror. Home, sir. Ethan paused, then nodded. Yes. The car eased into traffic, moving past glowing storefronts and quiet sidewalks where late evening pedestrians walked beneath tall buildings. Ethan watched the passing lights, replaying the conversation in his mind. Emily Carter had not tried to impress him. She had not recognized his name with excitement or treated him with special attention. She had simply answered, calmly, honestly. That was rare. His phone buzzed softly on the seat beside him. A message from his assistant appeared, outlining tomorrow's schedule. Back-to-back meetings, investor calls, and a strategy session at noon. Ethan glanced at the list, then set the phone aside without responding. For the first time in a long while, the schedule felt less urgent than the quiet thoughts forming in his mind. The car stopped briefly at a red light, and Ethan looked out at a small cafe on the corner where a young couple sat near the window, laughing softly over coffee. Their conversation looked unguarded, unfiltered, genuine. He realized how rarely he experienced moments like that. Most interactions in his world were measured, calculated, shaped by expectation. Emily's words returned again, simple and steady. Attention, not admiration. The light turned green, and the car continued forward. A few minutes later, they pulled up outside Ethan's apartment building, a sleek tower overlooking the city skyline. The doorman opened the car door with a polite greeting, and Ethan stepped out, the cool air brushing lightly against his face. He nodded in acknowledgement and walked inside, the marble lobby glowing softly under recessed lighting. The elevator ride to the 37th floor was silent. Ethan watched the numbers rise slowly, his reflection faintly visible in the polished steel walls. When the doors opened, he stepped into the quiet hallway and walked toward his apartment. Inside, the space was expansive and carefully designed, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city below. Yet tonight, the apartment felt unusually still. Ethan set his keys on the counter and walked toward the window, looking out at the glowing skyline. He loosened his jacket and rested his hands in his pockets, thoughtful. He had spent years building influence, building recognition, building success measured in numbers and headlines. But Emily's calm voice had introduced a different measure, one based on sincerity, on trust, on quiet observation. Ethan exhaled slowly, then turned away from the window and picked up his phone. He opened his contacts, scrolling briefly, then paused. Instead of calling anyone, he opened a blank note and typed a few words. People listen differently when they are not trying to impress you. He read the sentence again, then saved it quietly. A few moments later, he set the phone down and moved toward the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water. The city lights reflected across the surface as he stood in silence. Meanwhile, back at the restaurant, Emily Carter continued her shift, unaware that her quiet honesty had followed Ethan Caldwell across the city. She cleared a table gently, stacking plates with careful precision, then paused briefly as she glanced toward the door where he had exited earlier. Not with curiosity, but with quiet reflection, as if she understood that sometimes conversations left an echo long after words had ended. She returned to her work, her calm presence unchanged, while somewhere across Manhattan, Ethan Caldwell stood quietly by his window, realizing that the most meaningful insights often arrived not with volume or authority, but with a calm voice and the courage to speak simply. Morning sunlight spread softly across the glass walls of Ethan Caldwell's apartment, the city below already moving in steady rhythm as commuters filled sidewalks and taxis streamed through intersections. Ethan stood near the window with a cup of black coffee, watching the skyline shift from pale gold to bright daylight. He had slept, but not deeply. The quiet conversation from the night before still lingered in his thoughts, subtle yet persistent. His phone vibrated gently on the kitchen counter. A calendar reminder appeared, followed by a message from his assistant confirming the first meeting in 45 minutes. Ethan glanced at the notification, then took a slow sip of coffee. For years, mornings had followed a precise pattern, efficient and predictable, but today he found himself less focused on numbers and more on reflection. He walked toward the counter, picked up his phone, and scrolled briefly through overnight emails. Market updates, internal reports, investor inquiries. Everything looked familiar, structured, expected. Yet his mind drifted again towards something quieter, less measurable. Meanwhile, across the city, Emily Carter stepped out of a modest apartment building on a quieter street lined with small cafes and neighborhood shops. The morning air carried a gentle chill, and she pulled her light coat closer as she walked toward the subway entrance. Her movements were calm, unhurried, the same composed rhythm she carried into the restaurant each evening. She stopped briefly at a corner bakery, exchanging a warm greeting with the owner before purchasing a simple coffee and a small pastry. It was a quiet routine, one that grounded her before long shifts and busy nights. Back in his apartment, Ethan finished his coffee and reached for his jacket, preparing to leave. As he stepped into the hallway, he paused briefly, recalling the sentence he had written the night before. He opened his phone and read it again, then added another line beneath it. Respect grows where honesty is welcomed. He saved the note and slipped the phone into his pocket. The elevator descended smoothly, and moments later he stepped into the lobby where the doorman greeted him with a familiar nod. Outside, his car waited, polished and ready. Ethan entered the back seat, and the driver pulled into traffic as the morning rush filled the streets. The city felt louder now, more urgent, yet Ethan's thoughts remained measured. When they arrived at his office building, a sleek structure of glass and steel, Ethan stepped inside, passing employees who greeted him respectfully. He acknowledged them with small nods, his expression thoughtful rather than distant. Inside the executive floor, the quiet hum of productivity filled the space. Screens displayed charts, assistants moved efficiently between desks, and the morning meeting began promptly. As Ethan listened to the presentation, he noticed something new. He paid closer attention to tone, to pauses, to moments when someone hesitated before speaking. He realized how often ideas were softened before being shared, shaped to match expectations rather than truth. When the presenter finished, Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Is there anything you think we are missing?" he asked calmly. The room fell quiet. A young analyst hesitated, glancing briefly at colleagues, then spoke cautiously. Ethan listened carefully, encouraging the honesty rather than interrupting. The conversation shifted, becoming more open, more thoughtful. Meanwhile, Emily descended into the subway, the train arriving with a familiar rush of air. She stepped inside, finding a place near the window, her expression calm as she watched the city pass in brief glimpses between stations. She took a small notebook from her bag, writing quietly as the train moved. Observations, thoughts, simple reflections gathered from daily interactions. It was a habit she had developed over time, capturing small moments that revealed something meaningful. As the train emerged briefly into daylight, she paused, looking out at the passing skyline. Somewhere beyond those buildings, Ethan Caldwell moved through his own morning, unaware that the quiet influence of her words had already begun to shape his day, not through dramatic change, but through subtle awareness, the kind that grows slowly, like light spreading across a city at sunrise. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Ethan Caldwell's office, casting long reflections across the polished conference table as the final meeting of the day began to wind down. Papers were gathered, laptops closed, and quiet conversations filled the room as executives prepared to leave. Ethan remained seated, his attention lingering on the subtle details of the discussion that had just concluded. He noticed who had spoken with confidence, who had hesitated, and who had remained silent despite appearing thoughtful. It was a new awareness, one he had not consciously practiced before. As the room cleared, his chief operations officer paused near the door. "You seem different today," she said calmly. Ethan looked up, slightly surprised. "Different how?" She considered her words. "You listen longer. You asked quieter questions." Ethan gave a faint smile. "I am learning." She nodded, then left, closing the door gently behind her. The office grew still, the distant hum of activity beyond the glass walls continuing at a steady pace. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the skyline beyond the window. The city stretched endlessly, a landscape of ambition and movement, yet he found himself thinking again about the simplicity of the previous evening. Meanwhile, across town, Emily Carter stepped into the restaurant earlier than usual, tying her apron neatly as she greeted the staff with quiet warmth. The evening shift was just beginning, and the soft lighting gradually replaced the fading daylight outside. She reviewed the reservations, noting familiar names and new guests, her attention steady and calm. One of the younger servers approached her with a small concern about a table request, and Emily listened carefully, offering thoughtful guidance without drawing attention to herself. Her voice remained gentle, her presence reassuring. As the first guests arrived, the restaurant filled with quiet conversation and soft music, the same atmosphere that had framed the night before. Emily moved gracefully between tables, her awareness tuned to small details, noticing when a guest needed water or when a conversation paused long enough for her to step forward unobtrusively. Back in his office, Ethan checked the time, realizing the day had passed quickly. He closed his laptop and stood, adjusting his jacket as he prepared to leave. His assistant glanced up from her desk. "Heading out, Mr. Caldwell." Ethan nodded. "Yes." She hesitated briefly. "Dinner reservation tonight." Ethan paused, then shook his head gently. "Cancel it." She nodded, making a quick note. Ethan stepped into the elevator, the quiet descent mirroring his reflective mood. When he reached the lobby, he paused momentarily, considering something unplanned. "Take me downtown," he told the driver once inside the car. The driver nodded, pulling smoothly into traffic. The city lights began to glow again as dusk settled, the familiar rhythm of evening returning. As the car moved through the streets, Ethan watched the passing storefronts, his thoughts calm but deliberate. Meanwhile, Emily welcomed another group of guests, her smile warm but composed as she guided them to their table. The evening progressed steadily, each moment blending into the next with quiet elegance. Then, as the entrance doors opened, a familiar figure stepped inside. Ethan Caldwell paused briefly near the doorway, taking in the soft lighting and gentle music. He had returned without planning to, drawn by something difficult to define. Emily glanced toward the entrance, Her expression unchanged at first, then softened slightly in recognition. She approached calmly, her posture professional. "Good evening," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "Good evening." There was a brief pause, filled not with surprise but quiet acknowledgement. "Table for one," he added. Emily inclined her head and guided him to a table near the window, the city lights shimmering beyond the glass. As he sat, Ethan realized that this time, he was not here for business, not for negotiation, but for something quieter, something he was only beginning to understand, the simple presence of a calm voice that had changed the way he listened. Emily Carter placed a glass of water gently on the table, the reflection of city lights dancing softly across its surface as Ethan Caldwell settled into his chair near the window. The evening carried the same quiet elegance as the night before, but this time the atmosphere felt different, less formal, more personal. Emily handed him the menu, though she sensed he was not focused on the selection. "Would you like a few minutes?" she asked softly. Ethan glanced at the menu briefly, then looked back up. "I trust your recommendation." Emily considered for a moment, then nodded. "The grilled salmon is popular tonight. It is simple, but well prepared." Ethan gave a small smile. "Simple sounds good." She nodded and stepped away, her movements calm and measured. Ethan leaned back, watching the city beyond the glass. The skyline shimmered in quiet rhythm, headlights moving like distant streams of light. Around him, conversations flowed gently, but he found himself more aware of the stillness between sounds. A few minutes later, Emily returned with a glass of sparkling water, placing it carefully beside him. "Long day," she said, not as a question, but as a quiet observation. Ethan nodded. "Productive, but different." Emily tilted her head slightly. "Different can be good." Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. "I listened more today." She gave a small, approving smile. "And what did you notice?" Ethan paused, considering his words. "People often have better ideas than they are comfortable sharing." Emily nodded gently. "That happens when people are used to being evaluated instead of heard." The sentence settled softly between them. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You make it sound simple." Emily's expression remained calm. "Sometimes it is." She glanced briefly toward another table, then back at him. "I will bring your dinner shortly." As she stepped away, Ethan watched her move through the restaurant, her calm presence blending naturally into the evening. He noticed how she paused briefly when speaking to guests, how she listened without interrupting, how people seemed more relaxed in her presence. It was subtle, but unmistakable. When Emily returned with the salmon, she placed the plate carefully, ensuring everything was aligned neatly. "I hope this is what you were looking for," she said quietly. Ethan looked at the plate, then back at her. "I think I came for something else." Emily met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "And did you find it?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Perspective." Emily gave a gentle smile, acknowledging the answer without drawing attention to it. She stepped back, allowing him space to eat. As Ethan tasted the meal, he realized how rare it felt to sit without discussing numbers or agreements. The simplicity of the moment felt grounding. After a few minutes, Emily returned, refilling his water. "Do you always come back when something makes you think?" she asked softly. Ethan considered the question. "Not always." He glanced around the restaurant. "But sometimes." Emily nodded. "Thinking is easier in quiet places." Ethan looked toward the window again, then back at her. "You create that." Emily shook her head lightly. "I just notice when it is already there." The conversation paused naturally, neither feeling the need to fill the silence. In the distance, the piano melody shifted into a softer tune, blending with the gentle hum of voices. Ethan finished his meal slowly, appreciating the calm rhythm of the evening. When Emily returned with the check, she placed it gently on the table. Ethan looked up at her. "Thank you, Emily." She inclined her head slightly. "You are welcome." He signed the receipt, then looked out at the city once more, realizing that this quiet dinner had offered more clarity than many structured meetings. As Emily stepped away, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, aware that he had come searching for something subtle, and in the calm presence of the evening, he had found it again, not in words alone, but in the quiet understanding that sometimes the most meaningful conversations are the ones spoken softly, with no need for attention, only sincerity. Ethan Caldwell remained seated for a few moments after signing the receipt, his gaze drifting beyond the glass where Manhattan shimmered under the night sky. The city moved endlessly, headlights flowing like quiet rivers between buildings, yet inside the restaurant, everything felt calm and measured. Emily Carter returned to collect the folder, her movements as composed as ever. She glanced briefly at the receipt, then back at Ethan with the same thoughtful expression she carried in every interaction. "Thank you for coming back," she said softly. Ethan gave a small nod. "I did not realize how much I needed a quiet place." Emily held the folder lightly against her side. Quiet places help people hear themselves. The words settled gently between them, and Ethan found himself reflecting on how rare it had been for him to sit without distraction. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, but did not move immediately toward the door. Instead, he looked around the restaurant once more, noticing how guests leaned into conversations, how soft laughter rose and faded, how the piano melody carried warmth through the room. "You know," Ethan said quietly, "most places like this are built to impress." Emily tilted her head slightly. "And this one?" Ethan glanced around again. "This one feels different." Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Sometimes it is not the place. It is the people inside it." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding the quiet meaning behind her words. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "Do you ever think about doing something else?" Emily considered the question carefully. "I think about many things," she replied calmly. "But I also believe that where you are can still matter." Ethan studied her expression. "You seem to influence people more than you realize." Emily shook her head gently. "People change when they are ready. I just listen." The simplicity of her answer lingered, and Ethan felt the quiet truth in it. He gave a faint smile, then stepped toward the door. As he reached the entrance, he paused briefly and turned back. Emily was already helping another table, her calm presence unchanged, her voice gentle as she listened to a guest's request. Ethan watched for a second longer, then stepped outside into the cool night air. The city greeted him again with soft movement and distant sounds. His car waited at the curb, but he did not enter immediately. Instead, he looked up at the skyline, reflecting on how a simple conversation had shifted something deeper than he expected. He eventually settled into the back seat, and the car pulled into traffic, the restaurant fading behind him. Meanwhile, inside, Emily finished assisting her table and moved toward the window, adjusting a neatly folded napkin. She glanced briefly toward the street, where headlights moved past in quiet streams. Her expression remained calm, but thoughtful, as if she understood that some conversations continued long after they ended. Across the city, Ethan watched the lights pass through the window, recalling her words, her calm voice, and the stillness that had followed. He realized that success had filled his life with attention, but moments like this offered something deeper. Understanding. As the car moved through the glowing streets, Ethan Caldwell allowed himself a quiet realization that the most meaningful truths were rarely spoken loudly, and sometimes, the person who changed your perspective was not someone seeking recognition, but someone who simply chose honesty, leaving behind a silence that stayed long after the conversation was over.